trend of Season 7 has continued thus far. What's funny is this episode is really, really good, then makes two really big mistakes, one early on, one later on, and I'll talk about those, and then goes right back to being good. It's so odd having an episode like this to talk about, because it does so much right, it makes the mistakes almost more glaring. Now, they don't actually really detract from the episode, not in my opinion, but it was still just kind of, huh? Whenever I saw that. This episode is interesting because I've actually already really discussed this topic, and this is a first, guys, for the first time. So much of what I've discussed with regards to creative works and theoretical concepts and the production of a TV show and writing concepts has been in my Voyager series. As much as this is a rumination of Voyager, in many ways it has turned into, and has been for the last like 2 or 3 years at this point, just ruminations upon writing and the production of creative works. And yet, for the first time, one of those tricky topics has been discussed over on my Babylon 5 series before Voyager. I'm referring to the episode Passing Through Gethsemane, which is an episode in which I discussed the destruction of personality thing, and the massive, complicated situation that really is. Here, we have Star Trek tackling the death penalty, and, in my opinion, does a surprisingly good job of it. We do see several different aspects and key parts of this, and it even does it in a fairly typical Trek way, but I'm willing to forgive that because it does it to good purpose. Before I get into the main topics, let's just kind of go down the episode in order here. So first of all, they immediately send security to go help and deal with the people that are being transported. Now, you may ask why I'm pointing that out. Well, that's because that's kind of abnormal for Voyager. There's a thing that I've talked about many, many times, and it's probably one of the bigger things that I think is a problem with Voyager, and that's the fact that too many times things happen because plot. Because it needs to happen for the story to progress in a particular manner. And so, for example, it would be rather easy if, well, we need to get to this scene where X happens. Like maybe one of the inmates has to have this scene demonstrating that they are not a violent person, and so that means there has to be inmates fighting, which means we need to get the inmates on board, and under those circumstances. So normally, even though it flies completely in the face of common sense, Voyager would just be like, beam them aboard, and then we would cut to the action in one way. But instead, in this case, for once, what actually happens is beam them aboard and send security. Because that's intelligent. I only point that out because this episode does that in several ways, where they do the thing that they should do, that they should normally do, and the fact that they're doing it is actually kind of unusual because normally they don't. There's a scene not too far in where he mentions that these men are being sent to their executions, that all of them, all 8 of them, are sentenced to the death penalty. There's this really wonderful scene where the camera pauses on the 3 people present, who all just look generally uncomfortable. And it is Tuvok who specifically asks the question, what were their crimes? And the response was murder. As I discussed over on my Passing Through Gethsemane, or Gethsemane if you prefer, I usually hear it as Gethsemane, video, the death penalty, I like that scene because this is frickin' Starfleet. Later on in this episode, Tom will make a comment that about all the other people in the Federation penal colony. Thing is, and we've discussed this before, Federation prisons are practically resorts, at least in terms of the amount of humanity that's given to them. Now, I'm not saying whether that's a good or a bad thing. That's not what I'm here to judge or state. But compared to, Rurapente, for example, or real-life prisons that happen here in real life, it is a frickin' paradise. There have been points in my real life where I have lived worse than they live in a penal colony. So, I bring that up because it's logical why a group like the Federation would be uncomfortable with the death penalty. But that doesn't bother me in any shape or form because why would it? that bothers people now. It is such a sticky topic that it's actually difficult to discuss it without getting into histrionics, basically, while actually having a reasonable discourse in discussion. It is difficult to discuss that because it is such a long-standing issue that has been debated for decades upon decades, if not longer. One of the comments is made in this episode about the difference between life sentence and execution. And what I find interesting about that is, of all the arguments the doctor makes, the only one that he really hammers in on is the fact that he would still be breathing. And he doesn't say it that way, but that's the way I am saying it. He would not be in any way alive. He would continue to exist. Now, that makes a degree of sense, given the doctor's programming, but I find it very interesting that a conversation is happening between Seven and the doctor about that, given the fact that Seven had an entire season of a character arc about understanding the difference between existence and living, and at the end of that character arc, the conclusion of it, the Seven actually managed to convince the doctor of the difference between living and existence, and actually made the doctor agree that survival is insufficient. I actually really liked that whole arc in that episode. So it's kind of odd, but at the same time is still in keeping with the Doctor's character that he would argue for this. Especially since the very next point he hits is the possibility of rehabilitation. You know, life is a long time after all. The possibility of eventually working to be better or a less horrible person is something that would be on the table if they are still breathing. It is completely removed from the table if they aren't. I'm not going to really get into the death penalty proper. I kind of already talked about that over in my B5 episode. And I don't want to bring down the controversy box for the first time, I guess, actually, if we did that in Voyager. I just wanted to say that it is a very interesting topic, and the episode handles it with surprising grace. I was really surprised how carefully this episode handles that overall topic. It felt like so I mentioned earlier the episode has some flaws. I'm just going to nail those really quick here. There's one towards the beginning and one towards the end. Because it felt like the writer had this overall topic and structured it very well. You know, the connection between Seven and Aiko, the connection between Neelix and Joleg, those two interactions, the way they come together right towards the finale, and then the way that they are then shown in contrast to each other in the ending, is very important and very powerful and very well done. Great character dynamics, excellent guest star appearances. And then there's the scenes that had to happen because plot. Like I said earlier. So I decided to be a geek, just this once, never again, ignore my Klingon t-shirt, never again gonna be a geek. No, okay. I decided to be really geek out on this one. Because this is something that's actually irritated me in recent Voyager episodes in general. This is not the first time I've actually brought this up. He mentions that their planet is 13 light years that way. That's not that far. I mean, that's that far to us, obviously, but this is late Star Trek. This is Voyager, for God's sakes. 13 light years is a joke. And I could say that with definitive proof without even actually looking into it and finding out the specifics. But again, I decided, you know what, I'm going to be a geek. Would it surprise you to know that there is no 100% canon answer of how fast warp travel is? Because, of course, it isn't. This is Star Trek. They're not really that great at maintaining technical continuity. Back in TNG, they did have technical advisors, and they've had some on DS9 and Voyager as well, but keeping that straight across the whole series, the whole franchise, I should say, has never been a high priority and has never been done. That being said, I decided to use two constants. Voyager itself, and the way they treat warp travel, and TNG, and the way they treat warp travel, okay? In TNG, just to give you an idea of the vast differences, using the same warp scale, by the way, because the warp scale hasn't been changed at this point in history, I remind you. I am enough of a geek to know when they changed the warp scales, several times, actually. So, using the same warp scale, in the TNG era, it would take around 3 days at warp 9 to get to that planet. Not particularly that large of a trip. That's just, yeah, okay. In fact, that's probably as much time as they spent just sitting there waiting for them to show up. So the fact that they refuse to go help them drop it off, and the fact that it's in the wrong direction is kind of just, really, that's your complaint? You don't want 6 days out of your journey? Then I decided to use Voyager's scale and see how long it would take to go 13 light years in Voyager terms. It would take approximately 2 minutes and 6 seconds at warp 7, based on information from Voyager episodes. I'm not really making a massive point here, per se. I am just making the point that this happened because plot. They needed the episode to be centered on Voyager. Of course they did. They've already got multiple guest stars in this episode, so they don't have a lot of budget for location shots. And all of the action has to happen here so they can justify both Seven and the Doctor and Neelix all being involved in the character drama. So for plot purposes, it had to happen on Voyager, which means they need to keep these guys on Voyager, which means they decided to just have them sit here for the whole period of time. The thing is, I find that to be completely needless. It took me about 3 seconds, just now, actually. I didn't actually think about this until I started that sentence. It took me about 3 seconds to come up with an alternative. It takes 3 days to get there, so we spend the next 3 days going there. And the action happens on Voyager. Done. I find it to be a needless change, especially since it's so oddly nonsensical. Let's go ahead and talk about the other flaw. This is much later. So all of a sudden, the guy's brother attacks, right? You remember that? And it's a very badly written action sequence. I'm just going to say that as bluntly as I can. Voyager does not seem to understand the phrase fight back, or what it means, or how to do it. And as we demonstrate, Voyager massively outclasses the other ship. A couple of shots forces the other ship to retreat. And yet somehow the other ship is allowed to not only attack them for a sufficient period of time to bring their shields down to, I wrote it down as usual, 61%, but while Voyager's shields are still up, they manage to knock out power on just the right levels to knock out power to the cells that they set up. The prison cells, which is a massive convenience. And then in addition to that, they were preparing to beam them out while the shields were still up. And again, I hate to be one of those guys, but gosh darn it, make up your mind as to whether or not you can beam through the shields or not. And again, I'd point this out. I think sci-fi, this is one of the very, very few things Sci-Fi Debris and I are on the exact same line of thinking. They have made not being able to beam through the shields a plot point many times. And yet every now and again, just suddenly you can beam through the shields without effort. And they tend to vary whether it's significant or not. But the reason I tend to adhere to the idea that you can't beam through the shields is, A, it makes sense. Logically speaking, you have an energy barrier designed to prevent anything going through it. A transporter beam is a fairly complicated thing to go through that, so that just is logical. But number two, because most of the times when it is you can't beam through the shields, it's a significant plot point. It's something that adds either artificial, because it's been done badly, or real, because it's been done well, significant drama to a situation, making it so that that is a major obstacle they have to overcome, right? By contrast, most of the time when you can beam through the shields, it's just done because nobody thought about it, and there's no real emphasis on the fact that you can beam through shields, so that's why I have given that judgment call on that. I have a new follower on Twitter. Sorry, my phone is giving me updates here. I'm going to have to respond to a few questions as I'm done recording this. And I'm sorry, I'm actually not done with this stupidity, because in addition to all of the things I just mentioned, they're like, the idea that prisoners can be a problem on a starship in the late Star Trek era, which is basically TNG and onwards, is kind of ridiculous. If you remember, they had to really twist things around to make... Oh god, I can't think of his name all of a sudden. The guy in TNG... Oh, I can't think of his name. Whatever, I give up. You'll all tell me his name, and you'll all tell me the episode name, and I can't think of them right now. The gentleman who was, I was programmed, this was war... And then he manages to outwit everyone a few trillion times and does this basically as frickin' Batman at his worst. They had to go to that extreme to make a prisoner situation a conflict on the Enterprise. And I kind of understand that, speaking honestly. Because, and I've said this before, and I've said this across Voyager many times, when your protagonists have tons and tons of tools at their disposal, it becomes difficult to challenge them. And in this case, the situation had to be so that there was a tense standoff, and that Aiko had to prove 100% that he was a changed man, undisputably. And that had to change the mind of, I can't remember his name, Jurek or whatever his name is, the warden, which then led to the final drama of the piece. That had to happen. So, because plot, they needed this drama situation. So, I could just picture the writer, sitting here how the hell do I make this happen? There's so many ways the Voyager crew has around this, it's ridiculous. Finally, they're just screw it, the transporters are out. For 10 minutes, the transporters are out. They actually say that, 10 minutes, transporters are out. They even call that out, so I will give some credit. They do. Tuvok pretty much specifically says, "All right, I need to use the transporters." I'm not going to mention the fact that they could have used the transporters on the shuttles or the other, 100 ways they could have dealt with that situation. At least the writer is aware of the problem, and it's so weird seeing those two major flaws: the early incident and then the later incident, because everything else is pretty flawless in this episode. I shouldn't say flawless. That's an exaggeration. Everything else is good in this episode. So, for example, the fact that Tuvok just shoots a phaser through the Doctor to hit Aiko. I like that. Not just because it makes sense, and the Doctor is probably quick enough to be able to phase himself as the phaser shoots, but also the fact that it did cause a minor destabilization in his array, which, while that's actually nonsensical if you really think about it, is nevertheless consistent with how holograms have been portrayed across all of Voyager and some of TNG and DS9 as well. So it is logical that that would cause him some damage, some consistency there with it. Then they actually managed to whip up these prisoner cells out of nowhere, which are surprisingly well built and well constructed and fairly escape-proof as long as the power stays on, of course. Which then leads me to the next point. We see something here that, if I'm not mistaken, and I did just geek out earlier, so I may be about to lose all my geek cred, but I don't recall off the top of my head them ever doing this in any other episode. They make it so the fields stay up, but a hole appears in the field so they can hand food through to it. Almost every other time there's been a situation like that, they just lower the force field, walk in, do whatever, walk out and raise the force field. That is not only extremely interesting and kind of a logical extension of force field technology, but is the kind of thing you'd think they'd have for exactly this kind of situation. Hell, I can think of a dozen ways that could be useful. For example, let's say you need to enter an area that is being held with a force field to keep it contained, like there's some kind of airborne pathogen or maybe some kind of radiation that's being kept in there, and you need to just get in this one thing. There's a lot of uses and applications for that. Janeway is a bit smug when she comes back to the warden, basically saying, "Stop beating your prisoners." I'm not going to comment on the morality of the situation, because I'm not bringing down that damn controversy box, and it is not a linear situation. There's a lot of gray involved in that. But I am going to give my opinion that I don't think Janeway was standing on moral ground in that. I think Janeway was being a captain in that. She comes down very hard on the warden and says, "This is my ship. These are my regs. I'm gonna go ahead and follow your laws, but we're doing things my way. You are no longer in control of the prisoners. Period. The end." Not only is this consistent, because they've already done that with regards to how they feed the prisoners, but it is also very Janeway to try and basically over-assert her strength as a captain so that she isn't challenged on the matter. So I like the question that Seven posits to the Doctor, and it is the obvious one. It's the one that went through my head too. We need to do this procedure to save this man's life. Why? Now, of course, we know for the purposes of the plot in the episode why that happens, but again, we look at this and it's like, he's sentenced for execution. Why are we saving his life? And that is a very logical, very blunt question. But I do like the Doctor's reaction and his response. he may, I forget his exact wording, but he may be dead, but his blood is not going to be on my porch. He is going to be alive and well as long as he's in my care. Once I hand him off, there's none more I can do. But I am not going to let him die on my watch. And I like that. The topic I'm going to mention in brief could fill multiple videos. It has to do with the ugly truth of racial profiling in criminal code. It is a horrible, disgusting topic that has been a real problem in real life for as long as I am aware of, historically speaking. It is not pleasant. It is not fun to talk about. There's no interesting, engaging arguments there. It's just a giant mess. It's one of the reasons I'm not going to discuss it. I will say this. It is not hard to presume within the confines of this episode, with what we've seen in this episode, I'm really hammering that point in, leaving real life out of this one, that the Benkarans have been pushed into this racial profile of being criminals, and as a result are criminals. It's a sort of a self-fulfilling thing. In other words, believe it or not, as weird as this may sound, if you treat an entire group of people as if they're criminal scum for most of their life, most of them will probably consider just becoming criminal scum at that point, especially since that will allow them to continue to function. I mean, if it's not hard to understand the mindset, if you're going to arrest me for stealing, I might as well steal first, right? I also bring that up because it puts into light an interesting contrast. I kind of been building up to this point. Let me say what I like most about this episode. It shows both sides. It goes out of its way to showcase multiple perspectives, usually two, but sometimes more, in every single issue regarding the sticky problems that it's faced with. We've got the racial profiling thing I just mentioned, the severity of the death penalty, consequences of guilt, and of course, revenge versus justice is brought up as well. And it's brought up all of these topics are brought up multiple times at multiple points throughout the episode. It's very well crafted, aside from the issues I mentioned earlier. And the episode always goes out of its way to showcase at least two perspectives on any given point. Probably my favorite example of this is when it comes to Tom and Neelix. I mentioned this in brief earlier. Everybody's got a story. And yet Neelix hammers right back with the point, how many of those men were sentenced to death? And notice Tom is like, because it's a valid point. It is relatively easy to accept the possibility that, there's an old saying, and I forget the quote, but the quote goes something along the lines of, it's better for, I'm going to say this wrong, it's better for a system in which 9 guilty men go free and 1 innocent man goes free, than a system in which 9 innocent men or 9 guilty men are punished and 1 guilty man is punished, or something like that. The idea being that though it's worth taking the risk on releasing guilty people for the chance of releasing innocent people. It's a great quote. I wish, you know what, actually I might look this up, just because it is such a good quote. I don't want to misrepresent it. Give me just a moment. Well, there's actually a quote by John Adams, which is not the quote I was talking about. It is more important that innocence be protected than it is that guilt be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in this world, they cannot all be punished. But if innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned perhaps to die, then the citizen will say, whether I do good or whether I do evil is immaterial, for innocence itself is no protection. And if such an idea that were to take hold in the mind of the citizen, that would be the end of security whatsoever. That's actually a better quote than what I was just thinking about. John Adams. You get my point? The idea there being that it's easy for someone like Tom to say, yeah, everyone's got a story, and just dismiss all of them, even though, statistically speaking, it is likely that some of those men and women were sentenced there and were innocent, that their story was true. But it's okay to accept that in Tom's mind because they're in a Federation penal colony. And what did I tell you about that earlier? About the conditions of it earlier, right? Now imagine those people are sentenced to death. And that's what stops Tom, because now the possibility exists of innocents dying. Think about that. If I may bring up one other thing, there's a quote that I love. It's actually from Babylon 5, and again, I'm going to misrepresent it. I'm not looking this one up. It's from Sinclair. He says, the guilty die because they're guilty, and the innocent... Or, excuse me, I'm saying this wrong. The guilty run because they're innocent. Wow, now I'm really screwing it up. Hang on. Someone basically says, if you're not guilty, why run? And Sinclair's response to that was, the guilty run because they're guilty. The innocent run because they're afraid. And I really liked that quote, because it's a more complex answer to that question. If you're not guilty, why run? I've always found that to be such an asinine and naive mindset. There are so many reasons for the innocent to run, to plead, to beg. And that brings me to another thing this episode does very, very well. Neelix and Joleg have an expanding relationship throughout the course of this. Joleg is nice, polite, and plays the victim. He plays the victim in every scene he interacts with Neelix. From the very first time he sees him, he had him marked. Neelix is a kind individual. And kind individuals take sympathy on and take action to help victims. That's just fact. A kind person wants to help other people. They especially want to help someone who has been victimized. So he plays the victim the entire time. And he phrases his words, and he phrases his portrayal of his tone and his demonstration of circumstances, his guilt, the Bakaran situation, all to make him appear like a victim. Then he takes advantage of the situation and thinks, and at one point in the episode basically thinks, well, if I'm screwed, I might as well kill someone on my way out. Now, I have said a lot in favor of devil's advocate and the understanding of the nine guilty versus the one innocent and all that. But I'm sorry, if your mindset is, well, I'm screwed, I might as well kill someone, then there's something wrong there. Unless there's some really, really mitigating circumstances. So, Neelix finds out about this and has the natural response to this, to which the guy, immediately having lost all ground, does a much more transparent attempt at manipulation, which of course doesn't work at all. But he is so important to be shown in contrast to Aiko, because he is constantly, I'm the victim, and these people are trying to hurt me, and I'm just, it's circumstance, and maybe you could help, and maybe you could do this, or maybe you could be my champion. Aiko never asks for that. Aiko does not beg for his life. Aiko does not present himself as a victim. Aiko does not try to manipulate those around him. Aiko is straightforward, honest, and says more than once, I deserve to die, and goes out of his way to actively be kind to others, because that's the kind of person he is now. And of course, isn't it so wonderful that the con man links up with Neelix, and the person who is fundamentally changed, thanks to technology altering their brain, is the one who is paired up with Seven. Some serious thought was put into exactly who would be paired off who there, and it's the perfect fit. Neelix, of course, is a kind individual. He is, especially now, but he was a con man. You remember that? I've talked about this before. His character arc, his character development, which didn't actually receive as much screen time as it should have back in the early seasons, but it was there nonetheless. He became a good person, but he was a con man. He was just like Joleg was, really, without the murdering part. He was that kind of person. And so he understands full well what it's like to be that kind of person. He reaches out the hand, and it's batted away. And so he reacts the way he should. He just shuts the door, moves on. Aiko, of course, is someone who was legitimately wrong, incorrect internally. And that's, of course, a wonderful sticking issue here. I originally thought that this episode was kind of taking the easy way out by making Aiko not a terrible person who wants to redeem himself, but by making him more or less a new individual. In most ways that matter, he is a different person than before the surgery, or before the, whatever, we'll just call it surgery. But I don't think that's true anymore, because it uses that as a specific point of contrast. And, in my opinion, probably the strongest moment of the episode is when they find out that they didn't win. It's a powerful moment when Janeway and the Warden walk in, and the Warden, who has been won over to his side, who is now an advocate for him, who pushed for his government to insist the family listen to his evidence and insist on hearing him give his appeal. And neither of them can say anything. They're just crestfallen. And he says with regret, "I'm afraid that I have to take you back into the cells now." That's powerful. And while it does rob the episode of the possibility of true repentance, it wouldn't have nearly the same impact if it had been otherwise, because it wouldn't have had that same impact on Seven. Remember, 7 of 9 and 7 are very different people. And Aiko before and Aiko after are very different people. I don't need to connect the dots for you. This is a really strong episode. And it also, I'm sorry, one other way that that's relevant, really quick, is that it showcases, it better contrasts the difference with Joleg and Neelix. Because Joleg was someone who had no instability. He was just someone who was willing to kill. Joleg had the opportunity to try and redeem himself through Neelix, to try and become a better person. And his reaction was to manipulate Neelix into trying to get himself to escape. Whereas Aiko basically was handed the opportunity to be a better person. And for the most part, as a result of being a better person, he actively wanted to die because he understood the reality of his crimes now. Whereas Joleg was perfectly willing to murder again. The contrast between the two is brilliant. I'll leave you with one final note. Actually, I technically have another note here about a justice system where victims decide punishment, which is an interesting system because it, by definition, involves emotion and personal significance, which literally is a deliberate intent to take impartiality out of the equation. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not going to lay judgment on. It's just an interesting system, and I did like the concept, and would like to explore that more, but of course they really don't. But I leave you with this final note. I want you to imagine for a moment that you have been wrong your whole life, and then you do something horrible, and it doesn't mean anything to you, and then someone comes along and fixes you. And now for the first time in your life, you feel guilt. I think the actor who played Aiko did a really good job. He shows a gradual transformation, by the way. He's not just suddenly cured. Each scene he's in, he shows himself being just a little more moderate, just a little more understanding, just a little more soft and intellectual as he's slowly becoming to understanding the new him. But the scene where he's buckled over in pain was a very powerful scene. Because it's not that the pain is severe, it's that the pain is so alien to him, that he doesn't understand this kind of feeling, that he doesn't understand why he is this way. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to feel that level of guilt for the first time as an adult. It's powerful stuff. For now, I'm going to go ahead and hop off here, and I will see you guys next time.